Hi everyone, good to see you on my channel today. Today I will tell you a wonderful story. It is full of love and kindness. I hope you enjoy it and I wish you an enjoyable viewing experience. Thank you.
Lucy Stone turned down the street into the yard of her house and immediately recoiled in horror. A huge black Jeep, stinking unbearably of diesel fuel, was coming at her through the narrow driveway. A second more, and the woman would have been under its wheels, but she managed to dodge and jump on the curb. The bald, dark-eyed man behind the wheel of the car seemed to be amused by the jump. He laughed happily, pointing his passenger's hand in Lucy's direction, and honked a couple of times, apparently to humiliate the old woman. Scared the old woman and he's glad, Lucy thought angrily. Wait, what old woman? You can't think of yourself like that. Before you know it, you'll turn into a hunchbacked, poorly groomed hockey stick that can barely walk. Just a woman of venerable age. She restrained herself. Stone really did not look like an old woman. A slender, short, elderly woman. She had retired only 3 years ago, and she looked after herself very well. She wore gray hair, discreet makeup, kept her back straight, and always wore hats and elegant suits, even if, like today, she was just out shopping for groceries. She was firmly convinced that a woman must look dignified in any situation, and she built her entire life, her entire demeanor on that conviction. A hasty jump to the curb did not fit into her model of dignified behavior, so the episode with the Jeep made Lucy quite angry. Besides, the sudden movement made her right side ache with a dull aching pain, and her heart pounded like crazy. The woman decided to take a break on a bench in the front yard and catch her breath before going up to her apartment. Slowly approaching the front garden, Stone grumbled to herself, God has given us new neighbors, one worse than the other. This bandit in a Jeep has just moved in, and already he's causing nothing but trouble. And what a house it used to be. What a house it used to be. The house in which Lucy had lived most of her life was really not bad. In its time, it was considered elite, high ceilings, apartments of improved layout, quiet entrances, only a couple of apartments on the floor, a wide yard with a front garden and a children's corner, and all this a stone's throw from the city center, but away from the noisy thoroughfares, all the conditions for a decent life. The house was under the jurisdiction of the Ministry of Education, and apartments in it were allocated exclusively to institute employees. Not ordinary ones, but prominent scientists, professors, honored figures of science, academicians. Lucy herself, though she was a candidate of philological sciences, would hardly have been able to get into this branch of the scientific Olympus. But her husband, head of the Department of Physics, made a certain discovery, significant for the Soviet industry, and for this he was awarded an apartment in an elite house. All her life, Stone had been proud of her residence and her surroundings, but in the last few years her pride had been slowly replaced by irritation and regret. Researchers sold their apartments, some moved to simpler housing, counting on the difference between the sale and purchase to provide a decent life in retirement. Some went to the suburbs, deciding to spend their old age in nature, away from the hustle and bustle of the city. Some of the neighbors died, and the apartments were sold by their heirs, to whom it was simply unprofitable to maintain such expensive housing. Oh, those heirs! Their behavior invariably upset Stone. They sold off the old and even antique furniture from the apartments for next to nothing. They sacked the books that their parents and grandfathers had collected all their lives. They stacked reproductions of paintings and porcelain sets by the dumpsters, calling it all unnecessary junk. And these were the descendants of educated, intelligent people who had received not the worst education and upbringing. Lucy refused to believe it. Year after year, the house was gradually filled with nouveau riche people who had made their fortunes at the beginning of perestroika by buying and selling everything that people were willing to buy. A couple of apartments were occupied by obvious gangsters, like this jerk in a Jeep. He constantly blocks the approach to the square with his iron monster, stinking of diesel for the whole yard. In the next doorway there was a girl of a strange appearance, no other way than a keeper of some newfangled businessman. Several times a week she called her guests and organized parties, after which empty bottles were brought out of the entrance in boxes. The parties were invariably accompanied by loud music and dancing, and the noise from the girls' open windows could be heard throughout the yard. Stone thought with horror how the neighbors across the wall and downstairs tolerated it. But the worst of all, of course, was the lady who lived on the same lot with Lucy. "Good morning, Betty." Stone sank down on the bench where her neighbor, Practically the last of the old guard of tenants was already seated. "Good morning, Lucy," she said. "I see you miraculously escaped the accident. You saw that, didn't you? You must admit it's unbearable." For a while the women amused themselves by scrubbing the bones of the new tenants. Lucy learned that another businessman had recently moved into apartment 5. This upset her because it meant that the house would be undergoing another round of repairs, with the noise of perforators, dust from construction materials, shouting workers, and other inconveniences. Then they smoothly moved on to discussing the prices and assortment in the nearest stores, agreeing that they couldn't find any decent tea nowadays, and that meat was being charged at a completely obscene price. Betty mentioned that she was going shopping at a wholesale store the other day, and Stone ordered her a box of frozen hams. Lucy herself was no longer able to make such trips, and it was terribly difficult and inconvenient to take public transportation. But Betty and her husband had a car, so it wasn't difficult for them. Taking a breath, Stone was about to go home, but then her companion nodded toward the yard and said mockingly, "Look, our blessed one is coming." Lucy turned her head and barely managed to restrain herself from making a displeased grimace. From around the corner, her new playmate was walking toward the middle of the yard. Katie looked like the kind of old woman Lucy was afraid she would turn into. Full, with a withered face, deep wrinkles, and large, unkempt hands covered with pigment spots, slouching, she moved slowly, shuffling her feet. Her hair, which had once been russet, was heavily streaked with gray, which her neighbor refused to dye over. She twisted her braid into an old woman's bun at the back of her head, wore a stained dress from the nearest clothing market, and heavy shoes with square toes. She always carried a bulky tote bag that held everything from a water bottle to wool socks and pills for every ailment. But there was something else that annoyed Lucy far more than her appearance. Katie was a nurse. She told Stone about that when he'd come to meet her the day after he moved in. "So I know how to do everything," said the neighbor, smiling a little embarrassed, "and injections, and put IVs. I learned it while I was working at the hospital. Grandma Maddie, that's my grandmother. She was my mom," she always said. "Though, Katie, study, you'll be a doctor, or at least a nurse." "And what about you?" Lucy asked, wincing at the word mammy. "I don't care," she waved her hand. "First the children were small, then my husband got sick. I had to take care of him. And then Grandma Maddie fell ill, and I nursed her back to health. And then I was old enough to study after 40. So I've been a nurse all my life. Now I'm retired resting." Such a neighborhood Lucy, accustomed to the circle of scientists, professors, and academicians, could not bear. For her, it was the strongest blow to her self-esteem. It was also depressing that Katie's apartment was purchased by her sons, newly minted businessmen who had risen just on the resale of clothing and industrial goods. Merchant Stone did not like and even despised, and if these peddlers do not visit the mother, either by themselves or accompanied by wives and grandchildren, it is all the more offensive. The only daughter Lucy, whom the woman brought up in the best traditions of scientific intelligentsia, in whom she put all her soul, ran away from home at the age of 18, jumping out of marriage to some builder finishing, and since then has been shown to her mother very rarely. Stone sometimes communicated with Elizabeth on the phone, and knew that she had graduated from accounting courses, and together with his finisher organized a firm. She did repairs for the newly rich, she counted the profits, looked for clients, and was very proud of her business. But neither to communicate with her mother, nor to help her with money, Elizabeth did not seek. To recognize that some nurse managed to bring up children more successfully than she herself, a candidate of science, a specialist with higher education, Lucy was unpleasant, so she kept communication with her neighbor to a minimum. She never visited her, despite frequent invitations, talked to the woman coldly and a little downwardly, did not let her pass the threshold if Kathy tried to visit her. She didn't hold conversations, and unless there was a business matter to be discussed, she quickly called off the meeting and left. Kathy, however, was not particularly interested in being her friend. She talked to all the residents of the house in an even and friendly manner, maintaining good neighborly relations. She greeted Stone politely at meetings, exchanged a couple of doobie phrases about the weather and well-being, and sometimes bragged about a new book, bought, as Lucy suspected, at the station stall. The neighbor adored ladies' novels and soft-colored covers, and every time fervently recommended them to others with phrases, "So interesting. It's just like life." Stone was disgusted by this enthusiasm. A couple of times she told her neighbor her opinion about such literature. She was not offended, but stopped bragging about books. In principle, if to reduce communication to a minimum, the neighborhood of the nurse could be survived. If it weren't for one thing, Kathy was, from Stone's point of view, a crazy cat lady. She didn't have a single cat living in her apartment, thank God. But she actively fed all the yard and street cats, twice a day bringing them pots of her own porridge. She also bought pills and drops for her charges, took them to the veterinarian, treated sick cats, hospitalized them in her home, delivered babies, and put kittens in good hands. Betty once asked her how much money her neighbors spent on the cats every month, and when she found out the amount, she nicknamed her Blessed. It turned out that the nurse spent more than half of her pension on her hobby. Twice a week, Kathy organized fish days for her charges and cooked them porridge with capelin. The foul fishy smell filled the whole entrance and was concentrated as much as possible on the landing where Lucy lived. It seeped under the apartment door and seemed to spread throughout the entire apartment, through all the rooms. It made Stone sick to her stomach. She tried to talk to her neighbor about it a few times, but hadn't succeeded. "Why are you doing these culinary experiments?" she asked indignantly. "Feed your tail some Whiskas, they're a ready-made food now." "No way," Katie frightened. "I've learned that these foods can be harmful to cats, especially for outdoor cats. They get used to that kind of food quickly, and then they won't eat regular food. And I'm not forever. If something happens to me, the animals will have to fend for themselves. They won't find food anywhere, they'll starve to death." No, Lucy, I can't take that risk. I'm feeding according to the vet's recommendations." "Well, at least replace the capelin with some kind of fish." Stone was ready to give in. "It stinks to high heaven." "What else?" Katie wondered. "It's the cheapest. I take pollock, of course, but it's more expensive, and with my pension I can't afford it for such a bunch of animals." That was usually the end of the conversation. Twice a week, Stone has suffered from the intrusive smell, and all the other days she tried to run into her neighbor less often, so as not to spoil her mood. And today, she couldn't dodge the encounter. The nasty nurse was walking across the yard in the direction of the neighbors, carrying a shaggy gray cat covered in tangles. "Good afternoon, Katie," said Betty. "What have you got there?" "Good afternoon," said the nurse. "It's Mallory. I'm taking her home. We'll wash her today, get her hair cleaned up, and then we'll go to the vet tomorrow. It's time to sterilize her, she's getting older." "Sterilize her? Why?" Betty was surprised. "Well, otherwise she'll have kittens, and then where will they go?" "Not to drown them. It's better this way." "And the spayed one is easier to place," Katie said judiciously. "Sensible," Lucy suddenly agreed. "All we need is a bunch of kittens in the yard." "That's what I think," nodded the neighbor. "Lucy, are you all right? You don't look well, you're all yellow." Stone was indignant. What kind of manners is it to point out your appearance to someone? Although, what to expect from an uneducated nurse? Mallory's cat curled up in the woman's arms and she hurried away. "Let's go. Have a good day." "Yeah, Lucy, you stop by if you need anything. I have good pills from stagnation of bile, imported." The neighbor disappeared down the stairs. Betty looked at her friend and grinned. "Look, she didn't like the way you answered. Your acrimony is hinted at by the Blessed One. To insinuate something, one must have at least a minimum of intelligence," Lucy said sternly. "To sense the person you're talking to anticipate their reactions. Katie can't do that. She just talks nonsense." And Stone went home. There was still a tugging in her right side. Maybe it was biliary. "I should get checked out, get a checkup." Lucy had not been to the clinic for a long time, believing that only old people and old women went to doctors. But the pain in her side was becoming more and more intrusive, and she decided to go. "I'll go right next week," she thought. In the morning, the smell of boiled capelin wafted from under the door. Thursday, fish day, Lucy remembered with no pleasure. The woman glanced at the clock at 6 in the morning. It was so early, and that blessed nurse was already up and keeping her awake. She closed the door to the bedroom, but the intrusive odor didn't go away. She had to get out of bed and start a new day. The whole apartment seemed to smell of fish. Shampoo and toothpaste, freshly brewed coffee, and the orange muffin she'd bought yesterday at the neighborhood bakery smelled of fish. Stone opened the window to air out the kitchen, but immediately received a handful of sand in her face. It was a windy day, the dust from the sidewalk swirling in the air, instantly blowing into the apartment, settling on the windowsill and tables. Lucy slammed the frame shut irritably. Better an odor than a kitchen full of sand, she reasoned. After finishing her breakfast without any pleasure, Lucy decided to call her daughter. The last time she'd spoken to Elizabeth had been over a month ago. Her daughter had never called her, and catching her on the phone was problematic. Most of the time, when Stone called her at home, Elizabeth was either at work or on vacation. Mind, she resented Lucy for her infrequent contacts. I leave for work at 8 in the morning, and I arrive late in the evening, and I have no time to talk. I'm on the phone with clients all day. It's a business, you can't let it go to waste. Lucy understood, although she was a little surprised that even at weekends she couldn't get her daughter on the phone. The phone was usually answered by her son-in-law or grandchildren. The woman did not like to talk to her son-in-law, believing that the construction worker as an interlocutor does not correspond to her. With grandchildren, on the contrary, was not averse to chat, but the boys did not want to talk to grandmother. "Mom is not here. I'll tell her that you called. Bye," they quickly said and hung up. To call Elizabeth before work, Stone never tried it. Usually she woke up around 9 o'clock, when her daughter had already left for her office. But since she had to wake up earlier today, why not try it? Lucy resolutely pulled the phone to her and dialed the number. "Hello," came her daughter's joyful voice in the receiver. It didn't take 2 beeps, Lucy thought. "Hello, Elizabeth, daughter, hello." "Maman, is that you?" The voice became surprised and a little angry. "What are you doing up so early?" "I woke up and decided to call you before you went to work. I haven't heard from you in a while." "You woke up at 7 o'clock in the morning." My daughter was obviously surprised. "Why would I be surprised? Is it because you're already suffering from senile insomnia? It's a little early." Elizabeth giggled. Lucy frowned at the hint of her age, but she couldn't stand it. "In fact, you caught me on the doorstep," Elizabeth continued. "I'm already running away." "Elizabeth, wait 5 minutes." Stoner was indignant. "It's been over a month since you and I last spoke. I don't know at all how you're doing. Is everything all right? How are the boys? How can you do that?" "Well, my mama angrily stretched out her daughter. "Everything's fine with us, no special news. Harry and I are working. It's the season, it's summer. Everyone's doing repairs. We're helping them as much as we can for a modest fee." Elizabeth chuckled again. "The boys finished the year well. Now they are visiting their mother-in-law." This message scratched Lucy. She had repeatedly suggested that Elizabeth bring her grandchildren to her on weekends or vacations. The woman thought that it was time to begin to deal with their upbringing and education seriously, so that the boys would grow up something good. Since the parents devote all their time to work, it is logical that the grandmother should do it. But the daughter and son-in-law constantly rejected her suggestions. Say, "The boys are still small. Do not want to send them to spend the night in an unfamiliar environment. They are noisy and will interfere with the grandmother." The parents themselves want to spend more time with their sons. And then hello, they are visiting their mother-in-law. And what can give them a mother-in-law? A woman who barely graduated from a chef's technical school and all her life worked in the factory canteen. "Elizabeth, why did you send them to me?" Stone asked. "I want to see them too, and they'll be no worse off at my place. Come on, as soon as they arrive from mother-in-law, gather them to visit me." "Mom, the boys are there for the whole summer," Elizabeth said angrily. "Zoya's mom has a private house near the river farm. The boys have a place to walk and something to do. They like it there. She feeds them goodies, spoils them. After last summer, not a day passed without them asking to visit their grandmother. And you have an apartment in the city center, dust, noise, cramped yard, and no ecology." "What are you talking about?" "Last summer," thought Lucy, stunned. "You mean last summer they were already visiting there? And I've been fed stories and excuses. Wonderful." "Elizabeth, don't you think?" she began sternly, but her daughter interrupted her. "That's it, my man. I've got to go out now. Harry's waiting the car keys. Bye. Call me if you need anything." Elizabeth hung up without waiting for an answer. Stoner listened to the dial tone for a while, and then gently lowered the receiver of her phone to the lever. So that's how it is. They do not give her grandchildren, brazenly deceive her. Conversations avoided. Her daughter didn't even find it necessary to ask her how she was doing, if she had any health problems, if she needed financial help. All she could think of was to make a joke about insomnia. What kind of callous, insolent girl has grown out of her wonderful girl? "No, you mustn't think that," Lucy told herself. She had just called at a bad time. Elizabeth was in a hurry, so she had no time to ask anything. And about the grandchildren did not tell her, so as not to upset her mother. Well, in fact, if you compare, the private house of her mother-in-law is a much better place for the boys than her city apartment. Stone diligently chased away bad thoughts, although deep down she realized that a positive attitude would not help. Her daughter is insolent, callous, completely uninterested in her mother and not seeking to communicate with her. She had cut her out of her life when she was 18, and now she answers her calls not so much out of politeness as out of misunderstanding. She should probably admit it to herself and stop hoping for some kind of communication, stop groveling for crumbs of attention. But Lucy wasn't ready for that. Her husband had died long ago, her old social circle had broken up with his retirement and the change of tenants in the house. Her daughter was the only person close to her. Therefore, Stone could not cut her out of her life and continue to look for all sorts of excuses for Elizabeth. The mood was ruined beyond repair. Her right side was aching nastily, worse today than before. And then there was that intrusive smell of capelin. Damn it, I should tell that nasty cat lady what she thought of her and her pets. Yes, she's an ill-mannered, uneducated nurse. But she should eventually realize that her brews are interfering with normal people's lives. Lucy slipped her feet into her elegant house shoes and set off resolutely for her neighbor's house. A wave of choking odor from behind the neighbor's open door nearly knocked Lucy off her feet. Katie stood on the doorstep in one of her gaudy, multicolored dresses, her hair pulled back to the top of her head. An apron was tied over the dress, greasy or soaked around her belly. "Lucy," the woman splashed her hands. "What's the matter?" "Your face is gone. Come in, sit down." With a foot in a stubbed slipper, she pushed away from the door a snow-white cat with huge blue eyes and silky long hair. "Mallory, stand back and let the man pass," she commanded. Lucy, as belligerent as she was, couldn't help but be surprised. "Mallory?" she asked again. "Is that the one you carried yesterday?" "Yes, the one I carried yesterday," Katie confirmed, and bent down and stroked the cat's back affectionately. "We bathed her yesterday, brushed her, took out the tangles. Some of them had to be cut off, but it was no big loss. They'll grow back. And anyway, before the operation she'll have her tummy shaved." "I see." Lucy was surprised, but immediately remembered the purpose of her visit. She tried to straighten her back, but the pain in her side prevented her body from falling to the right. "Katie, I'm actually here to ask you a question," Stone began, but another jerk of pain on her right side made her wince and bend almost in half. Sit down," the neighbor almost forcefully dragged Lucy into the fish-smelling hallway and sat her down on a chair. "How long has your side been aching?" "I'll give you a pill now, a choloretic. It helps very well." Stone sank down on the seat and tried to object to the pill, but her side howled in a particularly strong way, and the woman collapsed ungracefully on her side and lost consciousness. She woke up in the ambulance, lying on an uncomfortable stretcher with an IV stuck in her arm. Katie's face loomed over her. "Be patient, my dear," the nurse said affectionately. "Why have you let yourself go so badly? You can't joke with bile at our age. We'll go to the hospital. They'll relieve the attack, treat it. Everything will be fine. I'll see to it. Don't worry. I used to work in this hospital. I know everyone there." Lucy suddenly calmed down from this chatter and again fell into oblivion. "Lucy, Lucy, wake up," she heard through her sleep. "Tomusia, we must wake up. We can't sleep so long. It's time, my good one. Open your eyes." "Mommy?" thought Lucy in surprise. The dream was insistent, tried to pull the woman back, but she overpowered herself and opened her eyes. And she saw the face of the nasty neighbor above her, still smelling of fish, it seemed. "Are you awake, Lucy?" the face asked her cheerfully. "What kind of Lucy am I?" said Lucy indignantly. Her voice was bad, her tongue was moving with difficulty, but the indignation proved to be a good engine, and she uttered the short phrase almost cleanly. "There, now you're awake." Katie laughed contentedly. "It's been half an hour since you opened your eyes, looked around, and then fell back to sleep. I've done everything I can to wake you up," she smiled again. "Lie down, Lucy. I'll call the doctor." "What doctor?" I wanted to ask Stone, but I couldn't. Katie disappeared from sight, and only in the ward there was a soft knock on the door. The woman tried to look around. She was lying on a bed, soft, reasonably comfortable, and unaccustomedly high. A needle was stuck in her arm, and a transparent tube stretched from it to a nearby drip. Behind the drip was a nightstand, and behind it another bed. The room itself was bright, surprisingly clean, and slightly cool. Lucy tried to stand up to get a better look, but then the door banged softly again, and she was called out sternly. "Where are you going, my dear? You're not supposed to get up yet." A middle-aged man in a white robe approached the bed. "Let's get acquainted," he said. "I'm Ivan, your doctor, and you're Lucy, right? How are you feeling?" Talking to the doctor clarified a lot of things. It turned out that Lucy's gallbladder had burst, and she had been brought to the hospital by ambulance with acute peritonitis and was immediately sent to the operating table. The operation lasted several hours because it was complex, and in the process there were some problems due to poor blood clotting and stone. But praise the surgeons, everything went well. The lethal outcome was avoided. Now Lucy will have to spend about a month in the hospital. Will have to wait until the stitches heal, until the normalization of internal organs. Plus, a couple of tests would be nice. "You can't get up yet," Evan said. "You'll have to lie down for about a week or your stitches could come apart. You shouldn't be rolling from side to side either, so try to take care of yourself. And Katie will be watching you, I suppose." "I will, of course I will," nodded the nurse. "I wouldn't want to leave a man completely helpless." "You're very lucky," Evan said. "We're short-staffed, with only 3 nurses and 2 orderlies for the whole ward, which is almost 100 beds. The girls are stretched thin. Naturally, it is impossible to provide quality care in such conditions. And you'll have a personal caregiver, and what a caregiver. I remember Katie's qualifications from when she worked here. You'll have the highest level of care." The neighbor behind him blushed slightly and looked down in embarrassment. Lucy thought that she would probably prefer the absence of a caregiver to the constant presence of this blessed woman, but she had no choice. The rule was a double. On the second bed was a young girl who was here also for peritonitis, only caused by an inflamed appendix. The peritonitis was missed. She had been on her feet for almost half a day, so the girl's condition after the operation was no better than Lucy's. She was also forbidden to stand up, required a strict diet and regular medication. Katie nursed her too, which annoyed Stone to no end. Not because she was in any way disadvantaged by this voluntary help. It was just that Lucy couldn't understand what was the point of these troubles, why the nurse was taking care of a girl she didn't know. She's trying to be nice to everyone, the woman decided. The girl called herself Leslie and made friends with her nurse surprisingly easily. She could spend hours talking to her, asking her about her past, sharing her half-childhood experiences. It was understandable though. No one visited the girl, and she was obviously bored in the ward. Talking to the nurse was at least some kind of entertainment. No one had visited Lucy either, although Kathy had informed her that she had told Betty and all the neighbors about her hospitalization. Stone had hoped that some of them might decide to check on her, but for the first few days there were no visitors. The woman decided that for the time being, because of her serious condition, she was simply not allowed any visitors, and forbade herself to think about it. It was a shame to realize that no one of the old guard of neighbors cared about her, and the uneducated nurse, who had recently moved into the house, was babbling over her like a small child. And Katie did care. Every morning she came to the ward, bringing with her a bag of food suitable for her ward's diet. She prepared different meals for Leslie and Lucy, which, although bland and dietary, were much tastier than the meager hospital kitchen. Kathy washed her charges, helped them to the toilet, cleaned them up after their sleep, and then began to feed them. She fed them literally from a spoon, deftly and carefully, gently coaxing them to eat the whole portion. She managed to treat her patients sternly and affectionately at the same time, and this manner was pleasant to Lucy, but it also annoyed her. A couple of days later, she asked Kathy to tell Betty to call Elizabeth and tell her everything. She hoped that her daughter would rush to the hospital and replace that stupid chicken Irina as nurse. She was already trying to talk Katie out of staying in the ward. "It must be hard for you to take care of me," Lucy said in a sympathetic voice. "Not at all," the nurse said. "Only 2 patients. It's a resort. When I was in charge of the whole department, that's when I had to run around. And with you, I even have time to read a book. But you spend the whole day here. What about your cats? Have you left them unattended?" Lucy pretended to worry. "The cats wouldn't go to waste," smiled Kathy. "My sister-in-law has moved in, and I've given her all the instructions on feeding and everything. She's taking care of Milord after her operation too, so we'll have to wait a couple of weeks before we can put her back on the streets." "There, I've given your sister-in-law a hard time," Stone lamented. "Not at all," laughed the nurse. "She's happy about it. She says that compared to the constant cleaning of a 2-story house and the daily care of 3 grown men, This is my son and grandchildren, that is, I have a resort for her. Katie had an answer for everything, and to Stone's surprise, she really wasn't unhappy with her situation. Nor did she try to use it, for example, to make friends with her neighbor to get closer to her. After the obligatory procedures, the nurse usually sat down to read a book or chatted with Leslie if she so desired. She did not impose communication on her charges, nor did she pester them with inquiries beyond the obligatory questions about their well-being. If it had been a stranger, his presence would not have weighed on Lucy at all. But it was Kathy, whom Stone had grown accustomed to dislike over the past year. And so the woman waited daily for her daughter and daily asked the nurse if Betty had mentioned calling Elizabeth. She answered in the negative each time, and Stone thought regretfully, I guess she hasn't gotten through yet. The morning didn't exactly start on schedule. After washing Lucy and feeding her broth and breadcrumbs, Katie settled into a chair by the window. The nurse usually went to wash the dishes after breakfast, then brought a bucket and a mop and began to tidy up the room. Today, the usual ritual was broken. I'll wait for the doctor, said the nurse. Yesterday you took tests. I want to ask how the results. What are the prognosis? Do you hope to find out how long you'll be with me? Lucy grinned. No, Kathy seems a little offended. I just need to know what to look out for. Maybe some medication to speed up recovery. Don't worry, if you don't feel well, I won't disturb you. I'll sit quietly. Or you want me to read you a book? Katie took out another paperback novel with a brightly colored cover. Very good author, she said in a pleased voice. I love reading her so much. She writes with ease, and most importantly, everything is true to life. May I ask? Lucy held out her hand for the book and peered at the cover. From Desperation, a mother of many children gave her daughter to an old oligarch, and after a while the whole family came to visit them. She read the abstract and laughed. Katie, so what's it like in life here? Do you know many families with many children to whom oligarchs matchmake? What's the big deal? The neighbor was surprised. I, for example, my grandfather and grandmother married like that. Your grandfather was an oligarch? Leslie raised her voice from her bed. Wow, were there oligarchs back then? Well, no, of course not. Katie hesitated. But my grandfather was a merchant of the first guild, by the way. He traded in women's merchandise. He had his own trading house in New York and a few other stores around the region. He supplied the imperial family with various ladies' trifles, yes. So in those days, he was an oligarch. A merchant, then, thought Lucy. I guess bargaining is in the family's blood. Wow, Leslie marveled, and tell me about her and her grandmother. Oh, please. Why don't I tell you about them? Agreed Katie, agreeably. Lucy, shall we interrupt your chatter? No, not at all, Lucy said politely. She couldn't bear to quarrel with her nurse and roommate. I'd like to hear it too. All right then, Katie said placidly. We'll pass the time until the doctor comes. Well, my grandfather was a merchant of the first guild. He had his own house in New York and a mansion in a village nearby where he went for the summer. He was a serious businessman. Grandma Mady said he made millions. He even patronized children's schools, paid scholarships to gifted students from poor families, and everything was going well for him. But God didn't give him any children. His first wife was a wastrel. They lived together for about 10 years, maybe more, and she still did not get pregnant. And then she died of consumption. My grandfather was widowed for the right time. He began to think of a new marriage. He really wanted an heir. He always said that's where they moved. The nanny moved in with them. She was already old. She didn't want to leave the children. She ran the whole household, looked after the kids, worked for room and board. And instead of a governess, my great-grandmother took care of the younger ones herself. Baba Madi said she taught them everything: history, literature, languages, drawing. She was an educated woman, and how she had time for everything, I don't understand. Katie shook her head brokenly and continued. Her great-grandmother got her oldest son a position, so she got him a job. And then Grandma Maddie grew up, 15 years old. It's time to take the girl out, to find a groom. But what's the matter? They haven't got a single decent dress left. They're all worn out. There was a debutante's ball planned, and Grandma Maddie could attend it by social status. But it was impossible to miss the event. It was still a chance. So my great-grandmother went to her relatives, near and far, to ask for money to get my grandmother together for the trip. She spent a long time in all kinds of reception rooms, and my grandfather noticed her in one of them. My grandfather was just talking business. He wanted a wife who'd produce an heir. Grandma Maddie was young, so there was a good chance. She came from a large family, and none of the kids had died, so she had a good heredity. And she's not rich, so she's not fussy, so she won't need a lot of money. He asked about my great-grandmother's family and came to talk to her. He promised that he would support the family, and if Grandma Maddie gave him her first son, he would provide a dowry for her younger sisters. He also demanded that the bride should be examined by a doctor and told if there were any health obstacles to having a child. Such conditions. It was like choosing a pedigree dog, Leslie said confusedly. Sort of, Kathy agreed. But in those days, brides were often chosen like that, by pedigree and for their own benefit. They didn't think much about love then, only in books. So Lucy was suddenly fascinated by history. Your great-grandmother agreed? Where could she go? The storyteller said in a self-evident tone. A mésalliance, of course. Wow, what words our nurse knows. Lucy marveled to herself. Mésalliance, Katie went on. Maddie's grandmother was from a noble family, an old family, and her grandfather was a merchant, and he was in his 50s, and Maddie was 15. But the great-grandmother realized that she could hardly find a better groom for her daughter in their situation. There would be all sorts of weasels chasing a title, and if there was a nobleman, he would be as poor as they were. But my grandfather was a solid man, trustworthy, with a reputation, and promised to support the family. So my great-grandmother made up her mind. And Grandma Maddie? Leslie asked interestedly. Nobody asked Grandma Maddie, waved her hand. She was just faced with the fact. But she was a sensible girl, she didn't argue. She only told me that it was humiliating to be examined by a doctor. I listened to her stories, and I thought 15 years old, what a girl. Now I have a granddaughter of 16. I look at her, well, a child is a child. She's still playing with dolls. So what marriage? What children? And back then they thought that it was already quite a suitable age to take on the role of a housewife, wife and mother. They brought up girls differently then, Lucy interjected. They were prepared for such a fate. And your grandmother, I think, would not have contradicted. She knew it was her duty to save her family, and duty for people of her background is very important, above all else. An aristocratic upbringing. She finished with meaning. Maybe. Kathy nodded. But I still felt sorry for her when she told me all that. Her great-grandmother was worried about her daughter, of course. After all, there was a big age difference with her husband, and she had to give birth as soon as possible. What if that merchant started hurting her? What if the conception didn't work out? There were all kinds of what-ifs, but everything worked out for Grandma Maddie in this marriage. A year after the wedding, she gave birth to her firstborn, a son, as ordered. Grandfather saw the child, she said, and wept with happiness. And from then on, he was ready to carry his young wife in his arms and never refused her anything. Grandma Maddie said that when her great-grandmother came to visit them, she saw how her grandfather treated her, then she only nodded her head. He was a merchant, a trade class, but he was so kind and respectful to his wife that she had not seen such treatment from every nobleman. And from her husband, my great-grandfather, that is, even more so. She was worried for nothing. Baba Maddie gave birth to 2 more children, a second son and a daughter by mom. And my grandfather kept his promise to keep Grandma Maddie's family, hired them a good house and servants. He arranged for the younger ones to go to grammar schools and boarding schools, gave the sisters a dowry, and paid for their trips to the world. In general, naturally, he saved the whole family. At least great-grandmother lived out her life in peace and prosperity. Why only great-grandmother? Leslie asked. And your grandmother Maddie did not live in prosperity. And what about the family millions? Haiti looked at the girl affectionately and condescendingly, as one looks at a child who has asked an obviously stupid and a little inappropriate question, but not with malice, but simply out of ignorance. It was at the turn of the century, my dear, she said calmly. My mother was born just before the revolution. My uncles, of course, were older, but all the same teenagers. And when the Bolsheviks came, my grandfather was shot, his shops were nationalized, and my grandmother and her children were evicted from the city as a class alien element. She didn't know what happened to her sisters and brothers until her death. At that moment, it was afraid to turn to them for help, as if they themselves would not be hit, and then they all got confused, you can't find them. At that time, many people changed their surnames and forged documents to hide their origins and traveled all over the country. One would never know where and under what names to look for their relatives. Baba Madi and her children wandered around the provinces for a long time. The eldest son became a revolutionary, joined the Red Army, and disappeared somewhere during the Civil War. The younger son died of diphtheria. It was a small village, about 20 yards. They made it a branch of a large collective farm, provided it with work, and gave it a house. My mother grew up there, met my father, and got married. In the 30th year I was born, and then my brother and sister were born. Grandma Maddie took care of us, and that's how we lived. "Oh, Katie," Leslie exclaimed, "you were just a little girl during the war, weren't you? Do you remember anything about her? Can you tell me about it? Or no, if you don't want to. If it hurts, don't tell me. You were evacuated, weren't you?" "Evacuated?" Katie said the word irritably. "Jesus, girls? They evacuated townspeople, factories with their employees, scientific institutes, factories. People who were potentially valuable to the state, you know. And who are we? Kolkhodsniki. Plowing the land and pulling weeds is not a valuable specialization. Anyone can be trained to do that, even any stupid person. Why should the state waste resources evacuating villages? When the war is over, they'll find someone to exile to collective farms and the concept of virgin lands." "I'm sorry, Katie," Lucy said conciliatingly. "I guess I'm still weak and my hand doesn't want to think. I didn't realize that your childhood was during the war years, so I asked you silly questions. You don't have to tell me if you don't want to remember." She was born a year before the war started, and she didn't remember the war years at all. "Remembering," said the nurse in a tone quite conciliatory, but with an obvious touch of bitterness. "If I had ever forgotten it, I'll tell you now that I've started. And our doctor's been delayed somewhere." Both patients fell silent and looked at the storyteller with expectant sympathy and gratitude. Kathy took a deep breath, gathering her thoughts, or perhaps her spirit, for the story. "Our little village was small, about 20 yards. I don't remember what it was called, and now I don't know. We lived mostly in vegetable gardens. We didn't keep cattle. It was expensive and troublesome. Working in the collective farm took up a lot of time. The only pet we had at home was a cat, Muska." "Of course," thought Lucy. "Where can you go without a cat?" Kathy, meanwhile, smiled gently. She could see that she was pleased to think of Muska. "Grandma Maddie said that cat was our babysitter. My grandmother would put me in the yard, fence me in with benches so I wouldn't crawl away, and she would rustle around the yard or dig in the vegetable garden. I sit down but I'm bored and cry. And then Muska comes to me. Around rubs, licks my face, paws touching, soothes so. Grandma used to say, you rub her by the ears, and her tail chewed, and her paws tied into pretzels, but she endures. She understands that as a child you can't hurt it, so she nursed me and then my younger ones. But those are already less. I helped babysit there. And Muska followed me all over the village like a dog. She saw me off everywhere. When the war started, all our men were taken to the front, and my father too. There was only one man left in the whole village, Uncle Archie. His house was opposite ours. He often came to visit us as a neighbor. That's what the younger ones called him, Archie. They couldn't pronounce Sergi. He was one-legged, walked on a wooden chair. Where would such a man serve? He asked for a job, but they turned him down. And we were left with only women and children and a few old men. It's clear that the surrounding villages were quickly taken over, but we didn't really know anything. Our village was on the outskirts. We learned all the news only from the radio. There was no other way. We heard the rumble of fighting from afar, but we didn't know what was going on, who was winning. But our ignorance didn't last long. The storyteller fell silent again, looked at the window, then at the door. The doctor is not coming for a long time today, she muttered as if to herself. Then she sighed and went on talking. It was a hot summer then, dry. But that day was especially hot. Mama and Maddie took the feather beds and pillows outside and laid them out to roast in the sun. They opened the cellar to dry out a little. We had two cellars, one in the house and the second outside on the outskirts of the plot where we kept potatoes. All the potatoes had gone out over the winter, so they opened it to fry them. We were all outside with the kids and my Muska was nearby. I was cradling her like a doll, and suddenly she'd burst out and run away from me. I followed her, and she went out of the yard and towards the open cellar. I'm after her, and she's darting into the cellar. She's squealing, and she's jumping up the stairs, and she's so skillful. I went after her, but I stumbled and fell into the cellar. Grandma Maddie saw it and ran after me. I hear her calling me from above, but I can't get up. My leg is badly bruised. So she got into a fight and started to come down after me. And somehow she turned around while she was descending into the crawlway and dropped the support, and the cellar lid slammed shut over her. And though it was wooden and cracked, it was heavy and well fitted, so it could not be opened from inside. Well, Grandma Maddie came down to me and felt me all over. She said, "You ain't broke nothing, Katie, just banged and scared. You can get back up on your own." So I climbed up the ladder, pushed the lid, but she wouldn't let go. And it's inconvenient to push it from the ladder. You can't push it anywhere. Grandma got beaten up, argued, moaned, came back down to me. We sat next to each other sitting. Muscat is here, mewing something. Grandma Maddie scolded her, saying she was a wicked woman who lured Urquhart here and me after her, you naughty girl. So we're sitting here, what else can we do? One hoped that Mom will look for us, call us, walk around the yard, and see that the cellar is shut. Maybe she'll figure it out, or the little ones will show her. We sat there for a long time. No one was looking for us. There was some noise outside. We made some noise in response, but not much. It's useless to shout. It hurts to pound on the lid with your fists, and they can't hear us either. I dozed off on my Grandma Maddie's lap, and through my sleep I could smell fried meat from under the cellar lid, like cutlets or, say, shish kebab. Where would meat come from at that time? I lay there, thinking, what a good dream. Then I got hungry and woke up finally. Grandma is also dozing. I hear her snoring. How long we slept like that, I don't even know. I whined, saying I was hungry, so she told me to crawl around the pit and look around. Maybe there's some potatoes or carrots lying around. So I started poking around. I didn't find any food, but I found a thick dirk. I don't know where it came from in the cellar. I told Baba Mady. She found it, grabbed it, and started beating the lid with it. It was easier to use it than hands from the ladder. It reached from the floor to the edge of the crawlway. My grandmother managed to move the cellar lid a bit with it, and then she pushed it down little by little. That's how she opened the way up for us. When we got out of the cellar, we saw that our village was gone. What do you mean, gone? Leslie marveled. Did you get into a parallel world, as in science fiction? No, honey, sighed Katie. It was our world, the very real one. And the ashes of our village were real, too, even smoldering somewhere. From our house, there was only the island of the stove and a pile of burnt logs. And from the neighbors' houses, too, where more, where less. No houses, no barns, smoke and ashes, embers, ruins, and the smell of burning above it all. Baba Mady is standing there, crossing herself, unable to say a word. I'm looking around, I can't understand anything. Muska came out after us, yelling something of her own. Here we see a man coming from the neighboring plot. We took a closer look, and it's Uncle Archie, all groomy, scratched and scraped up. He told us everything, how it was. He was hiding in the house from the heat. He heard a noise in the street, looked out the window, and saw Germans on motorcycles entering the village. They stood in the middle of the street, scattered to the yards, and started to pull everyone out of the houses. They searched barns, bathhouses, all outbuildings in general. One of the soldiers grabbed our mom and started to twirl her in all directions and squeeze her, touch her. She was beautiful, so he decided to have fun. But Mom twisted around, grabbed a shovel, and attacked him. While he was dodging, another soldier jumped up from behind and hit Mom on the head with a machine gun. The butt of the rifle pierced her head. She fell down. They dragged her into the house and threw the kids in with her and locked her in. Then Archie saw that the soldiers were coming to its house. He had a strange house with two entrances, one door to the street and the other from the house to the vegetable garden. So he jumped out the second door and fell into the raspberry patch. He had a thick raspberry patch, untended, all tangled up. So he hid there in the bushes till they didn't see him. He watched everything from there. The Germans gathered all the villagers in the street, women and older kids in a column, and the rest were shoved into the nearest houses and locked up, and the houses were doused with gasoline and set on fire. It was a hot summer, dry, and gasoline too. It caught fire quickly. Women were screaming, children were crying, people locked in their houses were pounding on the windows. One aunt jumped out of the column, ran to her house. Her mother was lying there, unable to walk. So they shot her down with a machine gun. And they drove our villagers down the road, shooting only upwards. And Archie, as soon as the column disappeared, crawled through the bushes to a vat with water. So he dived in and waited out the fire there. And when the fire died down, he went through the village to see if anyone else had survived. That's how he found us. Archie said, I'm sitting here looking at all this, clenching my fists, crying like a little child. And I realize there's nothing I can do. I'm not gonna help anybody. I'm just gonna get myself killed. And I'm so disgusted by it. A young woman grabbed a shovel. She wasn't afraid. But I, a man, a soldier, I've been through the war, and I'm sitting in the bushes. But this he said later. But then, as soon as he told me everything, my grandma Maddie turned and walked towards our house. I remember she was walking, her back straight. She always had a good posture. She was brought up from childhood not to hunch over. But then, there was something scary about that straight back. As if she had become wooden, as if she were not a living woman, but some pagan idol floating on the ground, heavy and clumsy. Granny came to where the porch stood, collapsed to the ground, and howled. Katie was quiet. Then she turned to her neighbor. You say, Lucy, aristocratic upbringing, dignity, that sort of thing. But I tell you, in moments of the bitterest grief, the blackest despair, every living creature, aristocrat, peasant woman, she-wolf, wolf in the woods, and stray dog, howls in the same way. It was a terrible howl, coming from inside, twisting the whole body. Archie and I were watching, but we couldn't move. I thought we should go over and comfort her, but that terrible howl chained us to the place as if we were in a daze. I realized later that we wouldn't have done anything then. How can you comfort when a man suddenly lost his daughter, his grandchildren, his shelter, his whole life? In fact, Grandma Maddie should have shouted it all out herself, wept, let it all out. There's no help in such a case. It's up to the man himself. The main thing is not to interfere with him. Lucy lowered her eyes. She didn't know what to say. She had never experienced such emotions before. Even the death of her husband and parents had been taken for granted and inevitable. But the nurse's story had shaken her. And not just her. God, how terrible, Leslie muttered and sobbed. We went into the woods afterward, Katie continued, not really paying attention to the sobbing. At first we tried to go to one neighboring village, to another, but it was useless, Germans everywhere. Then we decided to hide deeper and wait for our soldiers to come. They couldn't fail to come, could they? But we quickly realized that we couldn't survive even a summer in the forest. We had nothing with us, no tools, no warm clothes, no food. Only Archie had a knife. He'd taken it when he ran out of the house. And a bucket from the well, in which they used to carry coals from the fire. We kept it as the apple of our eye. It was like death to stay in the forest without fire. So the three of us went to the neighboring region. I mean, 4 of us, of course. Muska went with us. I refused to go without her. I persuaded Baba Madi that I'd carry her in my arms all the way, but I wouldn't leave her. And Grandma didn't mind. She said, how can I leave her here when she saved our lives? If she hadn't lured you into the cellar, Katie, we'd be lying here in the ruins like coals. And she apologized to Muska, saying, I shouldn't have sneered at you in the cellar, Cat. If I had known earlier, I would have sent my daughter and grandchildren to run after you. Anyway, Muska came with us. Part of the way I carried her, part of the way she ran beside me. We didn't walk fast then either. We didn't have much strength. We wandered hungry. We dug up some roots and chewed grass. Then, in the middle of summer, berries and mushrooms came. It became easier. So Muska, imagine, fed us. She caught eels or bigger birds or frogs and brought them to us. Archie would cut them up, roast them in pieces on twigs on the fire, and we eat them. You ate frogs? Leslie couldn't believe it. We ate frogs too, agreed the storyteller. Why shouldn't we eat them? The French eat them, but what are we worse? Muska saved us in the end. Already close to autumn, we were exhausted, and we never reached the neighboring region. We got lost, no other way. And one morning she wakes us up and calls us to go somewhere. She would move aside for a couple of steps, turn around, look at us and meow. So we followed her. It seemed like an impenetrable wilderness, but she kept calling. We're walking. We don't know why, but we're walking. And eventually we came to a partisan camp. It was so hidden that we wouldn't have found it ourselves. The cat is a beast. It understands such things better than a man. She smelled the shelter and led us to it, our savior. We lived in the camp for a while, got better, rested, ate a little. And then the partisans sent me and Madi to the railroad. They had their own people at the station, how to call it correctly, I did not know then, and now I do not know. In general, they put us on the train with the evacuees. With him we were there. That's where we finally settled down. Grandma Madi lived with me all her life, till she was 90. She had great-grandchildren too. And wherever we lived with her, we always fed the street cats, treated them, nursed them back to health. We thanked the whole cat family for being alive. And I still do. If it wasn't for the cat, I wouldn't be in this world. What about your Musia? You didn't take her with you to Sverdlovsk? Leslie wondered. No, Katie shook her head. Muska and Archie stayed in the partisan camp. Archie wanted revenge for the village and his fellow villagers, so he joined the partisan movement. They didn't look too much at his wooden leg. Muska refused to come with us. We thought that she let us know that she had helped us as much as she could, and she was only welcome in the camp. There were so many mice in the dugouts. So our cat, considered too, went to the partisans, finished the storyteller with a smile. You, Kathy, should write books too, said Leslie. Such a fate. The girl's eyes were still wet, but the partisan cat seemed to have cheered her up a little and calmed her down. No, Kathy waved her hand. Russia is full of such fates. Just dig. That's where people are unbending. That's where everyone had a notion of duty and dignity, no matter whether they were aristocrats or peasants. Lucy caught the remark, but did not reply to it. She was too much shaken by the story her neighbor had told her. In the soul of a woman rose at once in horror and pity and shame and embarrassment and empathy and admiration. Until all this will not settle, do not want to speak aloud. And I have no books to write, the nurse added. It's me who can talk well out loud, but on paper I can't string two words together. Even letters have always been hard for me. Oh, there's our doctor. Evan, we're waiting for you. Mom, wake up. Lucy heard through her sleep. She didn't want to open her eyes. All night long she replayed Kathy's story in her head, empathized with the trials the old woman and her family had endured, sympathized with her sorrows, was horrified by visions of the burnt village and the woman with a shovel, fighting off German soldiers, corrected herself for being so cold and arrogant with her neighbor, considering kindness to her beneath her dignity, for making fun of her fiddling with the cats. For all these worries I managed to fall asleep only in the morning, and then, Mom, wake up. My voice sounded irritated. A strong hand grasped Stone's shoulder and shook him. The woman grudgingly opened her eyelids, but immediately brightened. Elizabeth was standing in front of the bed. Elizabeth, my daughter. Lucy was both embarrassed and delighted. Betty finally got through to you? Betty? Yes, she called a week ago. She shrugged her shoulder. I haven't had time to get out to see you. You know, business, and your visiting hours are awfully inconvenient. I just got here, slipped the nurse a tenner to let her into the ward. Leslie squirmed in the next bed, raised her head, looking curiously at the guest. Hello, she said. Elizabeth ignored the greeting. I see you've got a nice place here, a room from the VIP segment. That's what the nurse told me. Who let me in, the girl explained. Let's go, she said. We have VIP rooms here. Well, I thought so. You bet. My mother will not lie with all sorts of. Lucy felt herself blushing. How are you getting on? She asked her daughter. Yes, well, I'm fine, Stone mumbled. She suddenly felt uncomfortable talking to Elizabeth like this, asleep, unwashed, and sleepy after a restless night. In addition, her bladder suddenly began to remind her of itself. Elizabeth, there is a vessel under the bed, Lucy said shyly. Hand it over, please. Where's your nurse? The daughter wondered, not moving from her seat. I was told that some grandmother is following you here. Did you hire someone? It's a neighbor taking care of me, the woman explained. A neighbor? Which one is that? I don't think you've ever really talked to anyone besides Betty. Elizabeth was surprised and seemed to have forgotten all about the request for a boat. The new neighbor on the court, Katie, Lucy explained. That crazy cat lady of yours? Her daughter raised her eyebrows. Are you friends with her or something? Watch it, Mom. Be careful. They say zoos are contagious. Soon, too, you'll be on the streets, fleabag monger's mongrel. Lucy blushed even more. She felt sorry that once in a fit of irritation, she had described to her daughter the new neighbor and her emotions about her. Out of the corner of her eye, the woman noticed Leslie's face. The girl could hardly contain herself not to cut off Lucy's musings out loud and rush to Katie's defense. However, suddenly realized her daughter, you said that she worked as a nurse. Well, that's right then, you'll get professional care. Good for you. You know who to get. Although, of course, I'd rather have a nurse than a nurse. But that's probably more expensive, isn't it? You, probably with your treatment, and already in a penny, given the room that Elizabeth, the ship, tried to remind Lucy. But then the door opened and Katie came in, carrying a bag of groceries, as usual. "Good morning," she greeted traditionally affectionately. "Oh, we have visitors already. Isn't it a bit early? There's a reason for the regime." "I do not fit your regime," said Elizabeth. "I cannot leave the clients for the sake of spending the middle of the day on the hospitals." "Of course," Leslie said as if to herself. "The clients, they are dearer than a mother." Elizabeth turned sharply to the girl, and Lucy realized that a scandal was about to break out. She hastened to intervene. "Katie, this is my daughter Elizabeth," she said. "She has a very busy schedule. Don't turn us into the doctors, if you would be so kind." "Elizabeth, this is Kathy." "Oh, you're the one taking care of Mom," the daughter said. "Oh, great." It didn't occur to her to say hello, of course. "Since your nurse is here, I'll go. I won't bother you," Elizabeth said. "She'll get you a boat, too, by the way." "Won't you wait for the doctor? We could have a chat," the nurse asked. "Why should I?" Elizabeth was surprised. "I see that my mother is alive, well cared for. What else? I don't understand anything in medical terms anyway, and your doctor will probably scold me for violating the regime." She picked up her purse and turned to Katie. "Do I owe you anything? What do you mean?" The woman didn't understand her. "Well, for taking care of you," Elizabeth explained. "You're wasting your time, your energy." Kathy frowned slightly. "I don't owe you anything. It's all right," she replied sternly. "I'm just helping out, humanly, neighborly." "That's fine," she instantly calmed down. "Yes, by the way, Mom, I brought you a guest. I almost forgot." Her daughter rummaged through her bag and put on the nightstand a plump bag filled with fat-fried aromatic chipurics. The women stared at it in bewilderment. Lucy felt like crying or falling through the bunk with shame. Her mother-in-law had gone wild yesterday, Elizaveta explained without embarrassment. "She fried a whole basin. What are we going to do with them? Harry has gastritis. I'm on a diet, and boys don't eat such things. You know today's teenagers, all they want to eat is hamburgers and pizza." "It's time for you to go, Elizabeth," Katie said suddenly and firmly. The girl didn't argue, and quickly disappeared out the door, waving goodbye to her mother. There was silence in the room. Lucy covered her face with her hands. Leslie said slowly and in surprise, "What on earth is this?" But Kathy silenced the girl with a quick glance. She leaned toward her ward, but Evan came in with his morning rounds. When he saw the package on the bedside table, he froze in the middle of the room and stared angrily at the nurse. "Katie," he said menacingly, "what are you doing? What's with the lentils?" "Lucy had her gallbladder removed, and we spent hours in the operating room trying to keep her alive. And you want to undo all of our work? Now every child knows that you need a strict diet after a surgery like that, and you, with your experience in our field, you're seriously gonna feed that to your ward. What kind of sabotage is this?" Stone hugged herself to the pillow. She was already terribly ashamed of her daughter and her inappropriate gift, which so blatantly showed her disregard for her mother. She had no idea how to explain herself to the doctor. She bitterly remembered how she had waited for Lisa, hoping that she would take care of her, get rid of her unloved neighbor. And she mocked herself. Had she forgotten what her daughter was? How dare she imagine her as a nurse? And to add to the mental anguish, her bladder was becoming more and more active. "Evan," Katie rushed over. "What do you think? I brought this for you. I mean, not just for you, for the entire resident and nurses. You know, I got a little crazy last night. Made a whole bowl. My son has gastritis, my daughter-in-law's on a diet, and grandchildren don't eat such things. They want hamburgers and pizza. You know today's teenagers," she ranted. "I know you're coming with your rounds, so I took them out right away to give them to you. You take them now immediately after the rounds have tea. And we'll wash up with Lucy, because we haven't had time yet. I've just come in, I'm late today." During this conversation, Katie slipped the doctor a bag with the unfortunate lentils and pushed him to the door, having secured his promise to come back in half an hour. After escorting Evan out, the woman walked over to her ward's bedside. "Lucy, are you all right?" she asked thoughtfully. "Shall we wash up?" "I'm disgusting," Lucy admitted frankly. "We'll wash up, but first, Kathy, I beg you, give me a boat." Lucy made a steady recovery. After a week and a half, she began to get out of bed, walking around the ward and then around the department. The atmosphere in the surgery amazed her. Only the corridor was clean and neat. The wards had not seen repairs for a long time, and cleanliness in them was kept very relative. In fact, when the paint was peeling off the walls in shreds, it was not an easy task to wash them clean. No matter how hard the local nurses tried, they could not achieve sterility and neat appearance of visits. Most of the wards had 6 to 9 beds. The narrow aisles between them were occupied by bedside tables. When it was necessary to bring a gurney into the ward, for example, when a patient from the operating room was placed, there was a fuss. The bedside tables were taken out into the corridor. Beds were moved so that the gurney could pass. Walking patients were asked to get off their seats for a while. And over all this mess, there was a heavy odor of sweaty bodies, medicines, human waste, cake blood, pus, and other secretions. No matter how much washing, no matter how much airing, no quartz, it was impossible to get rid of it. Lucy thanked fate that she was lying in more comfortable conditions. She realized, however, that fate had nothing to do with it. Even after Elizabeth's visit, she had been interested in her daughter's mention of the VIP wards. She tried to ask Katie and got a simple explanation. When you were brought in, there were no beds in the regular wards. You could either go in the corridor or here in the paid room while there were vacancies. Well, I asked them not to put you in the corridor. It's impossible to lie in such conditions after surgery. Thankfully, Evan and I have known each other for a long time, and he went along with me. Stona tried to ask questions about the cost of the room, how long she would be kept here, what would happen if she suddenly needed a paid place. But Kathy only joked and told her ward not to worry about the details. The mystery of the VIP place came to Lucy unexpectedly and shook perhaps more than all that she had already learned about her neighbor nurse. That day, 3 weeks after the operation, Leslie was discharged. The girl had already fully recovered and happily bustled around the room, packing her things and dreaming aloud how the first thing after arriving home would take a bath with fragrant foam. There was a shower room in the ward, but the patients were forbidden to wash. They had to wait until the stitches were completely healed. So they had only had body rubs and bited since they had been hospitalized, since they had been able to stand up and walk with confidence. Lucy was slightly envious of the girl. Leslie was picked up by her father, a middle-aged man, dressed expensively and stylishly and holding himself with restrained politeness. The girl hugged Lucy goodbye, and Katie dragged her along to walk her to the car. Stone stretched out on the bed and closed her eyes. It had been almost a month since. She'd been alone indoors in relative silence. Turns out she missed it dearly. She lay quiet and still and enjoyed the surrounding emptiness and lack of extraneous sounds, the chance to relax and not hold her face, to just take a break from everyone for at least a few minutes. When the ward door banged softly, she didn't open her eyes, wanting to prolong her solitude just a little longer. Perhaps Katie would think she had fallen asleep and go about her business for a while. The footsteps of 2 people rustled through the room. Then there was a slight rustle at the next bedside, and Kathy's voice came out in a half-whisper. "Well, that's what I thought. I left it under the pillow." "Come on. You shouldn't have come upstairs. I would have brought it to you myself." "Wait, Katie." A man's voice answered her, also muffled. Lucy recognized Tatiana's father. "I came with you on purpose to talk to you in private. Tell me, how long does your ward have to stay in the hospital?" "Until the end of next week. That's 10 days. Have you decided what you're going to do with the ward?" "Oh." Katie hesitated. "Not yet, but I'm going to speak to the ward manager today. There's a vacancy in the paid rooms right now, and hopefully they won't all be taken up in the next few days, so we won't have to worry. Even promised to help me with this conversation." "Katie, there's a simpler solution. I'll pay for this room for the next 10 days. Then it'll be yours, and you really won't have to worry. We'll consider it your fee for taking care of Tanya." The nurse's voice became embarrassed. "I got my fee in full. You let Lucy lie here. You didn't object to a second bed. That was our agreement, wasn't it? Leslie's discharged. You no longer need my services." "Then consider this a tip." The man's voice was insistent. "You see, Katie, it's not just that you've saved me money on the cost of a nurse and the hassle of finding one. I see the way Leslie interacts with you, the way she's bonded with you. That is more important to me than professional care. You have provided my daughter with emotional support. You have not let her slip into depression after the surgery. You have become a true friend to her. That's very important to her, and that means a lot to me. I was terribly worried on my business trip about how Leslie was taking it all. She's a homegirl. She's never even been to children's camps. She's never been away from home alone for a long time. I was worried that she would be scared of her new surroundings, that she would be oppressed by the pain and helplessness. But she didn't mention any of that yesterday or today. But she praised you to the skies and even asked permission to invite you to visit us. By the way, would you agree to visit us? Yes, of course, Katie said, confused. I'm very fond of Leslie too. That's fine, the man said. Then you go and take the book to Tanya and arrange with her the day of your visit. In the meantime, I'll go to the accounting department and make a payment for 10 days' use of this room. I'll be downstairs to hand you the paperwork. And Kathy, in keeping with your modesty, if 10 days isn't enough, just give me a call and I'll pay the extra. That's your tip, remember? There was a smile in the man's voice. A rustle of footsteps, a soft slam of the door, and Leslie Lvovna was alone again. The overheard dialogue stunned her. That was why her nurse had been so diligent in caring for Leslie also. She made a deal with her father that in exchange for the girl's care, he let Stone take a seat in her room. She didn't want her roommate, a stranger to her, lying in the hallway after surgery and then in a cramped room with a dozen beds that smelled like hell. You have to have some intelligence to sense other people, to anticipate their reactions. Our Katie doesn't have that. She remembered her own words with shame. It turned out that the woman she thought was an ignorant nurse had more than just intelligence and empathy, decency, and the ability to make quick decisions, and compassion, simple human compassion. Turns out it doesn't just apply to cats. Blessed called her Betty. No, not blessed. Just a normal person who managed to preserve purity of soul and true nobility in all his ordeals, and not lose sympathy for others. God, it's a shame she didn't see it sooner. Lucy, we're having a dinner party to celebrate your discharge tomorrow. Steamed fish, KB announced triumphantly, pulling out the pots from the fridge. Mwawa? Stone pretended to be frightened. The nurse laughed, and her charge laughed after her. I splurged on a pink salmon for the occasion, Katie announced, and my cats are eating pollock now. They're having a good time. My sister-in-law said that she doesn't agree to smell boiled capelin twice a week, so she's buying them pollock. Oh, I'm afraid they'll turn their noses up at my cheap fish. And why do you not buy fish at wholesale basis? Asked Lucy, chewing steamed pink salmon with pleasure. After all, it's cheaper there than in stores. You could afford for the same money in pollock. You'd have to go, and it's hard for me, and it's far away. Why don't you order from Betty? Stone suggested. She and her husband often go there, take orders from neighbors, bring what you need. What kind of savings is that? Katie laughed. She once offered to bring me a box of hams, and I said yes. And when I brought it, she charged me so much. It's cheaper to get it at the nearest market. She said for the delivery, for the time saved, but what did you want? I didn't want that. I refused to buy those hams from her. I said, eat them yourself. She never offered again. Lucy asked the nurse the price Betty had quoted her and was surprised to hear the same price she had always paid her neighbor. It was just that she did not go to Stone's markets, as she did not think it was a good place for her and preferred to store in stores. And to find out how much a box brought to her at the base cost, and even to check the information from Betty, simply did not occur to her. So the nimble neighbor was taking shameless advantage of that. So much for the old guard, so much for the senior researcher, the wife of an academic. Stone became disgusted. Of course, she's not going to confront her buddy, but she's not gonna stop shopping for her, that's for sure. Not out of greed, but out of unwillingness to face dishonesty once again. Having made such a decision, Lucy was a little surprised at herself. A month ago, having received such information, she would hardly have made such a decision. On the contrary, she would have justified Betty, thinking that the delivery and the time saved were really worth the money, that cooperation with her neighbors should be beneficial to both of them, and something like that. About the same way she was constantly making excuses for Lisa, for example. But now, after all the worries of the last month, Stone firmly decided for herself to accept the truth about people, no matter how unpleasant it seemed, and adjust her behavior with those people accordingly. She didn't have much life left to waste on those who hated or neglected her. The discharge was brought to them around noon. By this time their things were packed and the ward was tidy. Lucy washed and dried her head and changed into the dress and shoes her neighbor had brought her from home. She was fully prepared to leave the ward. As she walked down the stairs, she reasoned aloud. How are we going to get there, Kathy? There's no direct bus from here. Will we have to change buses? What bus, Lucy? The neighbor laughed. The car is waiting. She opened the hospital doors, and the stunned Stone saw a huge black Jeep spreading the scent of diesel fuel around her. From behind the wheel, a shaven-headed thug grinned with all 32 teeth. Here, Billy's agreed to help, Katie said in a satisfied tone, and pulled her stunned neighbor along with her. The bandit, named Vitalik, jumped out of the car, said hello to the women, and gallantly opened the Jeep doors. He helped Lucy into the back seat and said, "You can ride even lying down if you have to. The size allows, so don't be shy." Stone looked around the cabin with interest. Surprisingly, there was no smell of fuel inside. There was a pleasant coolness and a light fragrance of expensive cologne. Throwing a glance through the windows, Lucy was surprised to see almost no people on the sidewalks from the height of the Jeep. "How do you notice pedestrians, Billy?" she asked. With difficulty, laughed the bandit, putting KB in the front seat. "If they're in front of the car, there's a chance of spotting them. If they come from the side, I just can't see them. When I'm turning out of somewhere, I try to honk my horn, so some idiot doesn't get under my wheels. But mostly pedestrians notice me and jump back in time. This hippopotamus is hard not to notice." He patted the steering wheel of the car with a satisfied grin. "Well, are we all ready? Let's go." Billy the bandit talked animatedly with Irina Mavievna the whole way. It turned out that the bandit had an impossibly pedigreed cat, Brunhilde, with a very complicated character. Billy and his family had long been tormented by the animal, not understanding how to bring it up. But the former nurse managed to give the bandit some valuable advice. So, at her suggestion, Billy changed Brunhilde's litter box filler, and puddles in inappropriate places stopped. The family bought several scratching posts and climbing frames so that the cat had a place to release his energy without destroying the apartment. Brunhilde was taken out for walks in a harness and fed with sprouted oats, because of which the cat's attacks on indoor flowers stopped and torn pots became a thing of the past. Well, and something else on the little things. Lucy did not remember all the subtleties of raising cats, because at some point she felt worse. She was shaken up on the way. Her stitches, which seemed to be healed, began to ache, and she ignored part of the conversation. Toward the end of the trip, the woman decided to take Billy's permission after all, and lay down on the seat. But when the Jeep came to a stop, she thought with horror that now she would have to get up and scramble out of the high interior. There was practically no strength for that. Billy opened the door from the outside, peered into the back seat, and then somehow deftly picked Lucy up in his arms, took her out of the cabin, and carried her to the driveway. "Permit me, madam," he said gallantly. "I'll look after you a little. I have not carried such graceful and slender women in my arms for a long time." "You should have carried your spouse," rumbled Lucy, who was downstairs. "Katie, put your bags down. We'll deliver your ward, and I'll come down for them," said Billy the bandit sternly. "Go forward and open the doors." Then he leaned slightly toward Stone and said mockingly, "Alas, the last time I carried my wife in my arms was on our wedding day, and even then she was heavier than you, I must confess. And now she has grown into a woman. Now she's a corpulent lady, I'd even say monumental. I can only hold her in my arms, but I don't have the help for that. But you're a pleasure to carry. Don't deny me a little pleasure." Unexpectedly, Stone laughed heartily and easily. "He's a nice enough Billy, it turns out. Not such a thug." The neighbors brought Lucy into the apartment, laid her on the couch, and brought her bags in. Katie spent some time telling her what was in the refrigerator and on what shelf, and what to eat first. It turned out that she had once managed to cook with a reserve of dietary food to follow Stone's new dietary regimen for about half a year, no less. Finally, the escorts left, and Lucy was alone. She kicked off her shoes, stretched out on the couch, and closed her eyes. The apartment was quiet. No one rustled the pages of books. No one fidgeted on the next bed. No shuffling slippers, no whispered nonsense. It had been a long time since the woman had been alone in the room. And it suddenly became clear that it wasn't so pleasant. It would be nice to have someone around right now, Stone suddenly thought. Even if it's a cat. Lucy was coming back from the store. The bag pulled her hand away pleasantly. Although she was forbidden to carry heavy things after the surgery, the woman decided that 2 kilograms would do no harm. Approaching the turnoff to the yard, she cautiously peeked into the driveway and, making sure the way was clear, walked boldly along the asphalt. She had seen Billy's Jeep in the parking lot of the driveway when she left the house, and now she feared she would run into it on the way out of the yard. She already knew that the driver wouldn't be able to see her, but at the same time she realized that she wouldn't be able to bounce gracefully to the curb as she had before the operation. She would practice later, of course, but for now it was better to take preventive measures and make sure the way was clear. "Lucy," she heard a familiar voice. "You're back at last." Betty was coming toward her from the square, expressing her joy at her neighbor's return. "I saw them bring the vase home yesterday. That geezer agreed to it, for crying out loud. How did our blessed lady talk him into it? I told her to do it as a joke, didn't I?" "You advised her." Lucy didn't understand. "Well, yes," Betty began to explain. "She came to me first to look for a car to take her out. She said it was inconvenient to get there by transport after such an operation. There were no direct routes. The road would be exhausting. And it is risky. Someone in the crowd can push, get a stitch. She knows that we have a car." "And what do you do?" Lucy asked interestedly. "Oh well, you know our car, just a name." Waved her neighbor's hand. "It's old, it falls apart on the move. And on the other side, where your hospital was, there are such roads. Pothole upon pothole, not well maintained at all. We leave the whole suspension on them, and repairs aren't cheap these days." I jokingly told her that only Jeeps should drive on those roads. They are not afraid of anything, these all-terrain vehicles. "Try," I said, "to attract our Jeep driver." Well, I was joking, but she really. "Well, but you've ridden a Jeep. How was it? Wasn't it scary?" Lucy answered moderately, with restraint. "I saw through the window yesterday when he took you out of the car. I waited for you half a day, yes? Why did you come in?" Stone asked. "I thought that after the hospital you might want to wash up and clean yourself up. Then again, the apartment hadn't been cleaned for a month, so I wouldn't want to visit in such a situation, only to embarrass the owners," Betty said. Lucy nodded. She hadn't thought about the condition of the apartment and only now realized that the ubiquitous Kathy had somehow managed to clean it before she was discharged. At least there was no lingering dust, no debris on the floor, and none of the musty atmosphere that inevitably appeared in rooms that had been unventilated for a couple of weeks. "Oh, here comes the blessed one," exclaimed Betty, and pointing with her hand in the direction. The nigger was indeed coming around the corner, with her usual tomboy bag, surrounded by 3 cats of all kinds. Lucy, without saying goodbye to Betty, hurried toward her. "Katie, good morning. And you know, I was lucky enough to get a couple of kilos of pollock at the fish store today. I hope they have enough for one meal."
Thank you for watching this video to the end. Subscribe to the channel. Like it, write comments if you like the story, and see you on the channel.